Hi, it's Terry Ryder from Hotspotting, and this is my once a month only session for live Q&A. Your opportunity to throw your questions at me about real estate issues and markets, or if you're like most people, you'd be wanting to ask questions about locations where you may be thinking of buying something or where you already own something and are keen to get an assessment of where the market's at. Is it rising, falling, going sideways? So please give me your questions, write them into the panel that you'll see in front of you, and I'll do my best to ask them. If you've got a question about location, it's always helpful if you can give me a little bit of context. Just throwing in the name of a suburb makes it a little bit difficult, particularly as quite often there's 3 or 4 or 5 locations of the same name in different parts of Australia. So if you can give me a little bit of information about what you're looking for, what you want to know about, and why, it can help the process. So please give me your questions, and for the next 60 to 90 minutes, I'll do my best to give you some useful and helpful answers. In the meantime, till the questions start to come in, talk about some of the matters that are front and centre in real estate issues at the moment. Last night, as you're probably aware, we had the federal budget, and one of the issues that's coming up, given that this was very much an election budget with an election in the offing in the next month or so, one of the big issues for real estate is what the Labor Party plans to do with negative gearing and capital gains tax if it gets elected. Now, I just want to give you some numbers on property investors in Australia, because there's a lot of misrepresentation of the situation, particularly by senior members of the Labor Party trying to sell their policy as somehow being a method to help first home buyers. I think personally it's purely a revenue measure. It's got very little to do with helping first home buyers, because it's not going to really do very much to assist affordability by their own admission. But the way that Bill Shorten and Chris Bowen have been trying to represent this policy is that it's a measure to prevent first home buyers from having to compete with investors buying their 7th or 8th properties. That's something that I've heard repeated many times in the well, it's been an issue since the last federal election, when it was a policy of Bill Shorten and the Labor Party then. But what they attempt to do, I think, is to represent the typical property investor as somebody who owns lots of properties, 6, 7, 8 properties, and they're crowding out first home buyers. The reality is that according to the official figures from the Australian Taxation Office, there are about 2.1 million Australians who own investment property, but 71% of them own just one property. The figures show that they're ordinary households on ordinary average incomes, and they own just one property. Another 19% own 2 properties. So that's 9 out of 10 people who own investment properties in Australia own just one, which is most of them, or 2. Those who own 6 or more, the people that Shorten and Bowen are presenting as the mainstream, are certainly not. They're less than 1% of the total, relatively few, 0.9% of total investors own that many properties. So next time you hear them raise that as an argument, you know they're being dishonest and trying to misrepresent the situation. So turning to the questions that are now starting to come in, Sula, Sister, has the slowdown in New South Wales slowed down the Brisbane market? Actually, no. Firstly, I don't agree that there's a slowdown in New South Wales. There's a slowdown in Sydney. Regional New South Wales is completely different. Regional New South Wales markets mostly are rising, and some of them are rising very strongly. They're in a completely different situation to Sydney. And what you need to understand is that real estate markets arise out of local economic conditions. So Brisbane isn't going to slow down because Sydney has, because what happens in Sydney has very little to do with the market in Brisbane. It's all about the local economy. So Brisbane didn't follow Sydney into a boom. and it's not following Sydney into a downturn. It's just chugging along at its own pace, dictated by local conditions. And so the inference that there's a slowdown in New South Wales, I disagree with. The Sydney situation isn't slowing down markets in regional New South Wales because they're on their own cycles, dictated by their own local conditions. So we have a strong market in Orange, we have a strong market in Wagga Wagga and in Albury. Tamworth has got a pretty strong market. Markets in places like Ballina and Byron Bay are really strong, prices up in double digits compared to 12 months ago. So we don't even have the same situation in New South Wales. We don't have regional New South Wales markets following the Sydney model or example. They're doing their own thing, and I recently did a town-by-town, suburb-by-suburb analysis of regional New South Wales and found that 85% of locations in regional New South Wales have growing prices right now, prices higher than they were 12 months ago. So regional New South Wales isn't following Sydney's example, and Brisbane certainly isn't. It's doing its own thing. Okay, Hussein, couple of questions there. Can you provide some areas in Queensland, New South Wales I can buy high yielding blocks, units where there is growth potential? Well, I just mentioned regional New South Wales, Hussein, as very much a growth market. But I'll just refer to some figures here that were published quite recently, looking at which markets have shown the most growth over the last 20 years, and then they looked at which markets have shown the most growth over the last 5 years. And interesting differences there. In the last 5 years, the location, the market that's shown the biggest price growth is actually Hobart. And then you have competing for second place, you've got Sydney and Melbourne, but also regional New South Wales and regional Victoria. And then you've also got as contenders Canberra and regional Tasmania. So regional New South Wales is right up there, line ball with Sydney in terms of growth over the last 5 years. Plenty of markets in regional New South Wales which are currently rising, which have prices higher than they were 12 months ago. 85% of them, as I mentioned just a moment ago, according to the suburb by suburb, town by town analysis that we did only a few weeks ago. So plenty of growth markets there, and the advantage for investors, looking for markets to invest in New South Wales and finding, well, firstly, Sydney is very expensive, but also prices are falling there by and large. So you don't want to be buying in that market. The regional markets are, of course, much cheaper. The rental yields are much stronger, and many of these markets are growing. So I would refer you to markets like, say, Dubbo, Orange, Queanbeyan, just outside Canberra, Wagga Wagga, Albury Wodonga at the border with Victoria, Lismore, Ballina, Byron Bay. Newcastle's been a very strong market for the last couple of years, but I think it's past its peak and now starting to trend down a bit. But nearby areas like Lake Macquarie and the towns of the Hunter Valley are still strong markets with price growth still to come. And you mentioned also Queensland. Right now in Queensland, the strongest market is the Sunshine Coast. And I recently, in some of my broadcasts, referred to some of the price growth that's happening at the top end of the Sunshine Coast market, the Noosa precinct. All those markets up there have got exceptional growth. Now, if you're looking at annual price growth, Sunshine Beach, which is right next to Noosa Heads, is up 36%. The Noosa unit market is up 25%, around about 25%. Noosaville, its market's up more than 20%. And Sunrise Beach, as opposed to Sunshine Beach, is also showing really strong growth. And then when you look at the more central Sunshine Coast, to the suburb of Minyama, which is a canal residential suburb, it's up, I think, from memory, 24% in the last 12 months. And so really strong growth happening in prices on the Sunshine Coast, and that doesn't surprise us. We've been suggesting it as a coming hotspot for the last couple of years, based on primarily on the big infrastructure spend, more than $20 billion being invested in the Sunshine Coast in infrastructure and property developments, including the new medical precinct, extensions to Sunshine Plaza, the new Maroochydore CBD, extensions to the airport, upgrades to the motorway, and a lot more. We're also now seeing recovery in the markets in central Queensland. Mackay is very much at the forefront of the recovery there. Emerald's also starting to rise again. As yet, we haven't seen any return to growth in Gladstone, but there are glimmers of vacancies are lower than they were, and we're starting to see maybe the first signs of uplift in Gladstone after, say, 4 or 5 tough years. So plenty of growth markets around New South Wales and Queensland, but you're most likely to find them right now in regional areas. And as I said, cheaper prices, better rental yields, good prospects for growth if you buy in the right places. Okay, Adrian. You're asking about the Flagstone region in Queensland. That's, I think, down in Logan City area in the south of, so I'm just keying that into my ready reckoner here. It doesn't have anything on Flagstone. It's a new development area in the Logan City area, if I understand the area you're referring to, Adrian. So there's no long-term growth there. It's an area that's evolving through the development of major new master plan communities. Now, I'm just going to refer to it in my book of maps here so we can be a little bit more informative. So where Flagstone is happening, it's very much sort of west of the older suburbs of Logan City, cling to the transport spine of the M1 motorway linking Brisbane to the Gold Coast, and also the train line linking the 2 places. Then you go west, and that's where you're starting to see the development of these new areas like Flagstone, which 10 years ago was just countryside with no housing, and gradually, if you look at the most recent maps, the UBD maps for that area, it's just a network of proposed roads that have yet to be developed. So no long-term growth. I'm not sure the basis of your question, Adrian, whether you're thinking of investing in an area like that. I think you need to think about why you would buy there. These are very much new growth areas, so there's not much in the way of infrastructure, no motorways, no rail links, and not much in the way of schools and shopping. They'll come in time, no doubt, but if you're buying there now, you may buy a new sort of dual key type property or a duplex and get a pretty good rental return. But the question is, will you get capital growth? I'm just not sure where the growth is going to come from, particularly as there's just massive development happening there of new properties being built. Still, without understanding, the basis or the reason for your question, it's a little bit hard to be more definitive. But you were asking about long-term market growth for that region. Well, there isn't any, because there's no long-term growth record, because it hasn't been, as a residential area, hasn't existed for very long. Hussein is asking for some thoughts about Toowoomba. Now, Toowoomba's inland city, west of Brisbane, quite a substantial regional city, one of the largest inland cities in Australia, I think. It's an important city for that Western Downs Surat Basin region. It's become more important since the new airport was built. It's going to probably become even more important when the inland rail link from Victoria to Queensland is completed, because it's almost certainly going to take in Toowoomba. So it's for a number of reasons, it's going to become increasingly strategic. It's a strong, diverse local economy, lots of different aspects to its economy. It's always going to be solid. It's been through periods of strong growth in the recent past. Just more recently, the last few years, it's been a little bit stagnant. I think developers maybe built too much new stuff there, which has sort of suppressed capital growth for a while, but long term, I think it's going to be a strong prospect, a good one to consider. Sort of place where if you value sort of safety, solidity, buying in at a reasonable price, you're unlikely to get sort of boom time growth, but you're going to get steady, solid growth over time, and you'll get good rental yields, and it's fairly safe. Craig has just chimed in. As part of that discussion, $10 billion to be spent in the Surat Basin. Well, the Surat Basin is a resources area, particularly coal seam gas and a few other things. So it's been a boom region in the past while the resources investment boom was going on. Then it has more recently been a little bit in downturn in some of the towns out there like Dalby and Chinchilla, where a lot of new product was built by overly enthusiastic small to medium-sized developers when the resources investment boom was going on, left those places with major oversupplies, and it's taken a while to soak them up, but they're now starting to come back, as are other parts of Queensland where the local economy and the property market is influenced by the resources sector. Okay. Russell is asking about Warburton in Victoria. Things are taking off there. Tourism investment, world-class mountain bike track approved, many other things happening. Have to confess, Russell, I really don't know much about Warburton. Been around the country a fair bit, so generally if someone raises a location, I know something about it, but okay, I'm just trying to key it into here and see if it brings up anything that's useful. Okay, so what I'm seeing, just in some raw statistics about Warburton in Victoria, that the median house price has grown 17% in the last 12 months. It's now got a median house price of $485,000 based on 53 sales, so it's a smallish market, but certainly something's happening there, as you're suggesting. Given those numbers, sometimes the median price data can be misleading, and sometimes it's just outrageously misleading. Statistical anomalies, if you've got a very small sales sample, but in this case over 50 sales in the past year, so that's a reasonable sales sample, and the median price up 17% in the last 12 months. So there's action happening in that market, those figures would suggest, but I really don't know very much about Warburton. I strongly suggest, Russell, based on the information you've keyed in, you know a little bit more about it than I do. Sorry, I can't give you more insights there, but it's just not one that's come across our radar screen. But I'm actually going to write it down to remind myself to have a look at it in coming days, because clearly something's happening there that we probably need to know about. So thanks for the heads up there. Jason, do you think people should just shift their focus to investing in shares? No, Jason, I don't. I think people should, what they should do is stop reading newspapers and stop filling their heads with negativity and misinformation, and do some real research. And people who do that will become aware that we don't have a downturn in what the economists tend to call the Australian property market. We have a downturn in Sydney and to a lesser extent Melbourne, but it's not a national thing, and there are strong rising markets at different parts of Australia. And what people need to be aware of is where the rising markets are and turn their attention there rather than being overly swayed by the relentless and unreasonable negativity in our media talking about the downturn in the Australian property market, which is a creature that, as far as I'm concerned, doesn't exist. We don't have an Australian property market. We've got many different markets, hundreds of them, thousands of them maybe, around Australia. In a broadcast I did last night, I referred to the property clock published regularly by Heron Todd White, which is a national firm of property valuers. And what that showed, confirmed really, is the point I'm making, is we don't have an Australian property market. We have lots of different markets, all driven by local economic conditions. And there's many markets at different stages of the cycle. We've got markets at the peak, according to this property clock. We've got markets starting to decline. We've got markets that are classified as declining, other markets classified as approaching the bottom, other markets classified as being at the bottom of the cycle, and then we have markets classified as being at the start of recovery of their cycle, others classified as rising markets, and others rated as approaching the peak of market. And so if you look at their property clock, I'll just hold up a bit of an image of it there. You can see that at all stages of the clock, there are major locations around Australia at those particular stages. So there's no one situation. And far from being dissuaded from considering property investment, people should be targeting people on the left-hand side of the property clock, the ones that are somewhere between bottom of market to approaching the peak of the market. But I would suggest the ideal places to buy the ones that are at start of recovery or rising markets, and there's lots of them in Australia. Many of them are in regional Australia, but they're just not getting any media attention because most of our major media comes out of Sydney. They're obsessed with themselves and their own situation, and they don't think that regional Victoria is important, or regional Tasmania, or even Hobart as a capital city doesn't rate much of a mention. Canberra is overlooked. Adelaide, probably the most underrated market anywhere in Australia, just flies under the radar screen because of this obsession with Sydney's downturn and media's love of negativity. Russell just chiming back in with reference to Warburton, 70 kilometres from Melbourne in the Yarra Valley. Yeah, I'm going to do a bit of basic research on it later in the week, Russell, because you've piqued my interest that there's a location out there. Let me say this, regional Victoria, I think, undoubtedly is the strongest market in Australia right now. There's growth markets popping up all over the place. Now, we know about some of the bigger ones because they do get a little bit of profile in media. Geelong has been very strong for the past couple of years. Now we're seeing Ballarat. Many suburbs in Ballarat have got double-digit growth in their prices, some above 20%. Bendigo's following suit. There's lots of smaller places in regional Victoria that I don't necessarily know that well, but they're starting to pop up on our radar screen. One is the town of Benalla, which is a relatively small regional town that's got some significant things happening there that is causing its economy to expand and its property market to rise. Now, it would appear that, Russell, that Warburton's another one of those places that I need to find out a little bit more about. And as we're right now considering the new edition of one of our reports, Top 5 Regional Victoria Hotspots, it might be timely that you've made us aware of a place that maybe we should consider including, but I'll do some research and try to see what it reveals. Brian's asking about Margaret River. I'm assuming you're talking about the area in Western Australia. beautiful area, great lifestyle, etc. I don't think that there's a great deal of action in its property market. But, you know, there's nothing really making that market particularly pump at the moment. When the Western Australian economy improves, it's definitely recovering. Then we might see some of those regional areas performing better. But right now, just looking at some figures for Margaret River in Western Australia, we're certainly not seeing any growth in prices there. It's just a market that's marking time at the moment. So I don't see any particular action there or any reason why an investor would particularly single it out as a place to want to buy. You might be interested because you already own something there or live there, perhaps. I'm not sure, but certainly it's not sort of flying very, very high on our radar screen in terms of future hotspots at the moment. Bambi's asking, is there anything positive for the Latrobe Valley? Well, actually, very much so, Bambi. That's a market that's very much on our radar screen. In fact, I just mentioned that we're about to update our top 5 regional Victoria hotspots report. And we'll be looking at the locations that are already there and whether we're going to keep them there and whether we're going to put some new locations in that report. But the current edition of top 5 regional Victoria hotspots actually does include the Latrobe Valley because that market is showing really good possibilities. As I said earlier, regional Victoria, strongest market in Australia right now. Growth markets popping up everywhere, not just sort of north of Melbourne, you know, heading up towards Ballarat and Bendigo, but down southeast of Melbourne. We saw Pakenham and Officer have had big price rises. We've seen Warragul and Druin, those sort of locations in the Borbor local government area. They've had big growth, and it's now we're seeing the Latrobe Valley sort of sparking to life. It did appear at one point where the local economy was going to be adversely affected by closure of big industries like the, I think it's the Hazelwood power station. But various levels of governments have invested strongly in revitalising that economy so that families don't lose their livelihoods and unemployment doesn't rise. And so we're actually seeing some pretty good economic activity in the Latrobe Valley. And there's lots of towns out there, very, very attractive pricing, places like Traralgon, Morwell, Moe, medium prices, in some cases below 200,000. So very low entry prices, good rental yields. If you believe the Latrobe Valley has a future and might produce some growth, then it might be a good place to consider. Certainly we included it in the previous or the current edition of Top 5 Regional Victorian Hotspots for that reason. So Bambi, if you can get the Latrobe Valley location report on the hotspotting website as a separate report. All our location reports on individual locations are $55. If you'd like to learn more about what we think about the Latrobe Valley. Brian Kirkwood is asking a question, how reliable is Herentide Watch Property Clock? Look, I'll look through it in detail. I'll just hold it up again, Brian. You can just see that I've been looking at it and sort of highlighting sections and making notes on it because I looked at it in some detail to base one of my broadcasts around it earlier this week. And what I found was that in most cases, we would tend to agree with their assessment of where the various markets are at in terms of their stage of the cycle, their place on the property clock. Not in every case, there are a few that I disagreed with, but in most cases, yeah, we would agree. Now, the point about the people who put this together, this is a firm of valuers. They have offices in all these various parts of the country. So they're at the coalface of the local property industry. That they're not real estate professionals who have a particular vested interest in sort of talking markets up, they pretty much call it as they see it, tell it like it is. And so I think they've got a viewpoint that's really worth looking at and listening to. As I say, I don't agree with all their assessments, but 90% of them, I think they're pretty much on the money. And the ones where I disagree with them, well, there's a possibility that they're right and I'm wrong. To answer your question generally, Brian, I think it's quite valid. They've got a national property clock for houses and another one for units. The reports that they put out every month have a lot of information, a lot of detail, very big reports, looking at markets right around the country. They have summary sections at the back of the report, whether a particular market is, what the rental vacancy situation is, the trend, demand for new houses, volume of house sales, whether it's steady or rising or falling, all sorts of useful information. Like everybody else, they're not right about everything. They're not the gospel truth, but it's a viewpoint that deserves some attention and respect. Yeah, I'm finding it interesting and agreeing with a lot of their findings. Okay, Shane, despite the recent Reserve Bank hold on interest rates, Australia has historically followed the lead of the US. In the chance that we were to follow this lead, what would a doubling of these rates mean for capital growth and investors in the regional centres? Are you talking about interest rates, Shane, a doubling of interest rates? Or doubling of the cash rate? Well, it's not going to happen anytime soon. For a while last year, the thoughts of many of the observers was that the next move in the official interest rate would be up, but now they're all betting that it's going to be down if it moves at all. It hasn't moved for a long time. So it's going to take quite a few small increments before we'd see a doubling in the official rate. Yeah. Interest rates would have to go pretty high to have a major impact on markets. I think there's a bit of a fallacy out there. You see it often repeated in media by people who have very shallow knowledge of real estate markets and aren't really specialists, like economists, for example. And they tend to expand this view that low interest rates means a boom market and rising interest rates means markets crashing. Well, we've only had, in my time in real estate, two genuine nationwide property booms in Australia, the late 80s and the early part of this century. Recently, we haven't had a national property boom. It's been very much a Sydney-Melbourne story. But in the late 80s and in the early part of this century, those booms took place with interest rates that are much higher than they are now and were rising. In the late 80s, they kept lifting interest rates and the boom kept going. In the early part of the century, 2001, 2 and 3 interest rates were much higher than they are now. They're not as high as they were in the late 80s, and they were gradually rising, but it didn't dampen the property boom. So I just think there's a lot of erroneous comment about interest rates and the impact. There was a recent view expressed by a couple of economists that the recent Australian property boom, as they termed it, which never existed, it was Sydney and Melbourne, was caused by record low interest rates. And I think that's a nonsense, because record low interest rates applied right across the country, and we didn't have a property boom in Brisbane or in Adelaide or Canberra. Perth and Darwin went backwards during that same period that Sydney and Melbourne were rising so strongly. So if it was record low interest rates, we would have had property booms everywhere. There are other factors in play far more important than the level of interest rates. Our interest rates are low because the economy is deemed to be not where the Reserve Bank would wish it to be. Interest rates rise when we have a strong economy and they're trying to dampen things down. So you could argue that it's more logical that we'd have property booms when interest rates are higher and rising than when they're really, really low, as they've been lately, as evidenced by the fact that we've had many markets in decline during this recent period of record low interest rates. So Adrian, just referring back to Flagstone, you purchased a house in Flagstone. Yeah, as I said, yeah, there's no long-term data because it's so new. So you can't have long-term growth rates for a suburb that didn't exist a few years ago. So, Adrian, I'm not sure whether you bought a house there to live in or whether as an investment. Sorry, it's a PDO of the Queensland government. Okay, yeah. The question is, what's going to drive capital growth? In other words, and the capital growth will occur if there's buying demand there, and the demand is strong relative to supply. That's the key thing. People tend to buy in areas where it's close to jobs nodes because people want to buy close to where they work, close to key things like public transport, major infrastructure, shopping, schools. So that's my question about these new areas in the short term, at least, because they build the houses, and eventually when there's enough houses, they start to think about maybe putting in some schools and some shops, etc. So there's a bit of a time lag before the essential infrastructure catches up, and it's going to be quite a long time before we get any motorways or rail links built to these places. So that's the area of concern that I have about it. Okay, so yeah, I'll just refer back to us. There was a little bit of interest from some of you out there in the Heron Todd White National Property Clock, just referring to where they place the various major cities on the property clock. They've got Canberra starting to decline, Melbourne and Sydney as declining markets. Well, I think most of us would agree with that. Darwin is approaching the bottom of the market, and I think they're right about that. Darwin has been in decline during that period that Melbourne and Sydney were booming. So it's according to Heron Todd White, it's sort of now towards the bottom of the market, and it's just starting to show some signs maybe of recovery. But the local economy, you've got to understand that it's about the local economy. I had a question earlier, will Brisbane follow Sydney? Well, Brisbane market's got nothing to do with what's happening in Sydney, nothing at all. It all arises out of the local economy. Darwin, the Northern Territory economy, has been really struggling in recent years and still is. And so Darwin property market has just been in decline, both rents and prices. So they've got Perth at the bottom of the market. Also agree with that. Perth's starting to show signs of now moving into recovery, and it's one to watch. Then they've got Brisbane at the start of recovery stage on the property clock. They've got Adelaide as a rising market and Hobart as a market that's approaching the peak of the market. Now, I can't disagree with any of that. So I think their assessment and the way they've placed markets or locations on their property clock are pretty much on the mark. And if we look at some of the regional areas, they've got Newcastle and the Illawarra, including Wollongong, as declining markets. And yeah, that correlates with our research. Both Wollongong and Newcastle have been through a couple of years of good, strong markets with rising prices. Central Coast as well, but they're past their peaks, and that shows up in our research. We've identified that over the last 6 to 12 months, that in terms of sales activity, sales volumes, demand in the market, those markets are past their peak, and so the level of price growth is starting to wind back. So I think they've got that right. On the other side of the property clock, start of recovery, they've got a number of locations in regional Queensland, and also agree if they've got Mackay, for example, Townsville, Cairns. Definitely agree with that. And then rising markets, they've got places like Ballarat and Victoria. Definitely agree. Launceston and Tasmania, undoubtedly right. Some other places in regional Queensland like Hervey Bay and Emerald, yes, I think so. And a few other places in regional Victoria like Shepparton and Mildura, rising markets, yeah. Approaching the peak of the market, they've got places like, as well as Hobart, amongst the capital cities, they've got the Sunshine Coast. Sunshine Coast has been very strong, still is, but yeah, they may be right that it's approaching the peak. It's been rising for a couple of years now. Okay, so I'll just check through the questions that have come in so far. Please keep typing your questions. Happy to do my best to answer anything that you want to throw at me to do with residential property issues, markets, and locations around the country. Okay, while we're waiting for a few more questions to drift in, I'm going to refer to some other research that I saw published recently, just a few weeks ago, looking at changes in dwelling values over the last 20 years and which markets have grown the most. Now, according to these figures from CoreLogic, the national average growth in property values over the last 20 years is just a little bit under 200%, which means they're suggesting that property values on average across the country, it's a big generalisation, but this is the average situation for Australia's property values have trebled in those 20 years, according to what they're saying here, 197%. Now, the number one market, some of these figures might surprise you because Sydney only ranks 4th in terms of growth in dwelling values over the last 20 years. But Sydney, prior to its recent boom, had about 10 years when it didn't do very much. So Melbourne's number one, 275% growth in 20 years. Number two is Hobart, which has had over the last 20 years, has had a couple of, but I've got a bit of a mini boom happening right now, and also had a boom sort of around 2003, 2004. Number three is Canberra, and then Sydney's number 4, Adelaide 5, Brisbane 6. Amongst the regional markets over 20 years, regional New South Wales is number 1, regional Victoria is number 2, regional Tasmania number 3. And nothing terribly surprising about that. Regional Victoria, New South Wales, Tasmania, all markets that are strong right now and have been over, say, the past year. Now, regional Tasmania, alongside Hobart, has been really strong. It's very hard to find anywhere in regional Tasmania where prices have fallen, but very easy to find locations where prices have risen quite a bit. Very similar in regional Victoria. I think the strongest market in Australia right now as a general statement. And then regional New South Wales, I think I mentioned earlier, that recently did town by town, suburb by suburb analysis of sales activity and prices. 85% of the locations, we looked at over 300 locations, and 85% of them have prices higher than 12 months ago. So very different to what's happening in Sydney. So just looking at further questions. Will Labor's negative gearing kill new investors? Question from Arne. Yeah, it's going to be very much a topic of debate. Look, it's a stupid policy. It's being dressed up as something to help housing affordability. It won't, and I don't think it's really intended to. It's a revenue measure by a potential future Labor government. It's got very little to do with affordability. I think it's going to do some damage. It's worth remembering that a previous Labor government back when Paul Keating was Treasurer, scrapped negative gearing, and within a year or so they brought it back in because it had unforeseen negative consequences, which included soaring rentals in some of our major cities because it created a shortage. And I think similar things will happen again in our bigger cities. But killing property investors, look, you need to get it into perspective. Firstly, what they say is if they win the next election, they'll bring in these new measures at the start of 2020. So, and anybody who already owns property, it's unaffected. If you buy property between now and then, it will be unaffected by the new measures. So that needs to be kept in mind. So anything you buy between now and the end of the year won't be affected by any changes they make, so they say. The other point is that negative gearing will still apply to new properties. So if you buy a new apartment or a new house and land package, you'll still be able to use negative gearing. The other thing to keep in mind is negative gearing only applies if the property is in a loss situation, if the costs of owning the property are more than the income, the rental income of the property. If you buy property with a sufficiently high yield, negative gearing becomes irrelevant because you're not negatively geared, so you're not affected if they change it. So right now, many of the markets that are pumping and getting lots of interest from investors are in places like regional Victoria, where you can buy in Ballarat or Bendigo and get rental returns above 6%. And if you're borrowing at below 4%, you're starting to get in that territory where you're going to be cash flow positive, or at least cash flow neutral, and negative gearing is irrelevant. So they can change it as much as you like. If you're buying in markets like that, you don't care as an investor because it's just not relevant. Where it's most going to have the impact is in the big cities like Sydney and Melbourne, where typical rental yields right now are like 2 or 2.5% or 3% at most. And without negative gearing tax write-offs, buying investment property at high prices in those markets becomes a lot less attractive. You're totally reliant on big capital growth to make it worthwhile. In the meantime, you're losing money. So I don't think investors are going to be buying that sort of property in those cities, and we're going to end up with a shortage of rental properties and rents will rise. That's what happened last time negative gearing was scrapped, and I'm pretty sure it'll happen again in the bigger cities. So Leanne is asking, what are your thoughts on the Townsville market, especially in the wake of the recent floods? Yeah, I mean, impacts from events like the floods, they were quite pretty serious and major, and some of the residents of Townsville suffered a great deal, and there were a couple of people who lost their lives as well. So you certainly don't diminish the impact of those events. Long-term, in real estate terms, I don't think they have a huge impact. Australia is the land of the natural disaster, floods, cyclones, droughts, bushfires. It's a constant presence in this country, and there are very few locations around the country that have not been affected by some of those types of events. So they have a short-term impact, but not necessarily a long-term one. You also got to keep in mind that the images you see of events like the Townsville floods tend to give the impression that the whole city's been devastated, when in actual fact only a small percentage of Townsville was actually flooded. Similar to the big floods in Brisbane in 2011, only a very small percentage of suburbs in Brisbane suffered from the floods, and the vast majority of the Brisbane metropolitan area was unaffected. So markets overall aren't too drastically devastated by events like that, Leanne. Looking beyond the floods, Townsville is a market that's been through some tough times, but it's now starting to emerge from them, and I think it's got a great future. It's in a very important regional city. It's got a lot of diversity to its economy, and most importantly, there's a big infrastructure spend starting to happen. I mentioned earlier Sunshine Coast, where you and I live, which has been revolutionised in terms of its economy through infrastructure spending, the new medical precinct, the airport, the CBD, and a whole heap of other things. Over $20 billion worth of investment is happening, still to happen. And so the Sunshine Coast economy has changed and become stronger, and it's created jobs. New people have come to live there, and now we're seeing some big price growth, and particularly in the upper end of the Sunshine Coast market. Now, Townsville has got similar things in its future, I believe. In our Townsville report on the hotspotting website, we list all the projects that we know about that's currently happening or proposed to happen, and it's even bigger than that $20 billion on the Sunshine Coast. It's over $25 billion in the case of Townsville, and Townsville is actually a smaller city, so the impact is pretty big. Now, when some of those things, well, some of them are already happening, like the new stadium, but as those projects are rolled out and they're creating jobs and economic activity, the Townsville property market's going to rise. And so it's one worth considering if you can get over that hump about it being up there in that tropical zone where they have cyclones and floods, such as the one they had recently. And as a result, the insurance premiums are pretty scary high. That needs to be taken into account. But I think Townsville, as an important regional city, has got a big future, and its property market's going to show some growth in the next few years. Certainly anybody marketing property up there will be able to say that if they weren't affected in the recent floods, then they're probably unlikely to ever be affected by flooding, because that was, a 1 in 100 year type event. So Shane is asking, do you agree with Heron Todd White's sentiment on the Sunshine Coast? Well, their ranking on the property clock, Shane, is that the Sunshine Coast is approaching the peak of market. It's probably not too far from the truth. I just think it's got a way to run, though, because I think what's happened on the Sunshine Coast is actually some really big game-changing events happening, and it's really at the beginning of something. Sunshine Coast is going to be a growth city and a growth market long into the future because of what's happened, and it's going to build upon what's now happening. A $5 billion medical precinct. I mean, that's massive. It's a whole new industry that the Sunshine Coast previously didn't have. The new Maroochydore CBD is just starting to evolve. That's a big, big thing that's going to evolve over 10 and 20 years. The airport's going to have $400 or $500 million spent on it. It's going to become an international airport. Rail links to the actual coast is part of the Sunshine Coast future. Right now, the rail line runs through the hinterland inland, but part of the future planning is have rail links coming into the Sunshine Coast, as they did on the Gold Coast in recent years. So I think in this particular cycle, it may be true that the Sunshine Coast is approaching the peak, but I think it's long term, it's got a really big growth future. Brian says something a bit different for you. In New Zealand, you have to have your house assessed for traces of illicit drugs when selling. Wondering why they have this, but Australia doesn't. Well, could be that because New Zealand's a more progressive country than Australia. I don't know. New Zealand's got a history of being a bit of a leader in all sorts of things. I have to confess that I was born and bred in that country, but grew up with an awareness that New Zealand, despite being a very small country, tucked down the bottom of the world, has led the world in a number of areas, such as the welfare state, such as being the first country to give the vote to women, and a whole heap of other things. And I think we've recently seen recent events in Christchurch, the kind of leadership that New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has brought. New Zealand's has elected 3 women as prime ministers. They're a long way ahead of Australia in terms of those sorts of things. So it may be just part of that thing New Zealand has of being very socially aware, often being the first in the world to do good things. And I think we're seeing recently the reaction to what happened in Christchurch as an example of the sort of country it is. I'm not saying it's a better place in Australia by any means, but just that it's a very progressive country, and perhaps less conservative than Australia. Okay, give me your thoughts on that if you dare. Kieran's asking my thoughts on capital growth potential in Gympie. Yeah, Gympie's got a lot of potential, I think, and I've actually been talking to some of the business leaders of Gympie. I'm going to be going up there in about a month's time and speaking at a breakfast business event on that very subject, the potential for the economy and property market of Gympie. One of the things that's in play at the moment is that Gympie's not far from the Sunshine Coast, and its connections between the two places have improved through upgrades to the motorway. And Gympie's real estate is a lot cheaper than the Sunshine Coast. Sunshine Coast is a relatively expensive market. Gympie's a lot cheaper. So young buyers are looking at Gympie and say, well, it's not too far away. It's a lot cheaper. We can buy our first home there, and we can drive, we can commute to the Sunshine Coast if that's where they work. So that's one of the things in play. There are a few other things happening up there. It's a place with a lot of potential, I think. One of those markets that tends to fly under the radar screen, but because of its links to the Sunshine Coast and what's happening on the Sunshine Coast, the growth there, I think increasingly you're going to see its property market attracting buyers out of the Sunshine Coast for its relative affordability. Angus is saying, missed your comments on Latrobe area, regional Victoria. Which towns do you recommend looking at? Traralgon. Yeah, Angus, I just mentioned that Latrobe Valley economy is going quite well. It's recovered from big business closures like the Hazelwood coal-fired power station, partly through proactive investment from various levels of government to make sure that economy didn't suffer as a result of those sorts of events. And the towns there got very, very affordable real estate, and Moe and Morwell and Traralgon. Traralgon's probably the number one town there to consider. I think it's a little bit more expensive than the others, but still got a medium price. I'm working on memory here. Rather than do that, I'll call up some figures so I can be a little bit more definitive. Yeah, I was about to say that Traralgon's median price is still below 300,000, high 200. Yes, it's 295,000. It's grown 2 or 3% in the last 12 months. I think we're just starting to see the beginnings of growth there. And if we put in Moe, median price just under 200,000, so 199,000. But that's despite having grown 11% in the last 12 months. That's for Moe. So we put in Morwell. Yeah, its median price is 165,000. So very, very cheap real estate. But there is some growth momentum in these markets. So they're worth considering. I'll just pop in one more name, I think. Churchill. Yeah, median price 177,000. So great, high level of affordability in these markets. And you could say, well, they're cheap for a reason. There's been a bit of economic struggle in recent years in that area, but it's starting to improve, starting to revive through proactive investment by government and others. So I think it's a possibility worth considering. We do have a report on it on the Hotspotting website if you'd like to learn more about why we think it's worth considering. It's also included in the current edition of the Top 5 Regional Victoria Hotspots report. We're about to update that, but I'm pretty sure at this stage that the Latrobe Valley will be in the new edition, because I think it's just starting to show something. So Natasha is saying they do test for drugs in Australia. I'm aware drug tests do happen in houses, but I don't think it's a condition, something that's mandatory when you're selling a property. I don't think. If you know something different, Natasha, if you could type that in and let me know. And it could well be that different parts of Australia have different rules, because we do have, different states, and this country is different to New Zealand, where there's just they don't have state governments. It's one reason why they don't have insidious things like stamp duty or capital gains tax, because they don't have to fund state governments. Louis is asking, what do you think about Cairns real estate capital growth potential? Look, I think it does. It's just been a bit sluggish. We've kind of expected it to do a bit better, I suppose. But a lot of regional Queensland has been slow in recent years, and it's just starting to revitalise. I just wonder where Cairns is on. Yeah, I'm just looking at the Heron Tide White property clock that I've referred to a number of times. It's been part of the discussion today. They rate Cairns as start of recovery. Okay, now that probably makes sense. Cairns has been a little bit in the doldrums, just not so much in downturn, but just not showing any great growth momentum in its real estate market. And Heron Tide White is suggesting that it's starting to move that way. I think we would tend to think that Townsville's got more potential for forward momentum than Cairns at the moment. It's a more well-rounded economy, more diverse. Cairns is still very much hooked into tourism, and that's kind of a bit of a fragile, fickle situation, whereas Townsville's got a lot of other things. It's got manufacturing, it's a big government administration centre, it's got a big university economy, it's got a big military economy, all of those things. It's got much stronger links to the resources sector, which at times can be helpful, and it's got tourism as well. So if I had to choose between Townsville and Cairns, I'd be going for Townsville, notwithstanding the recent devastating flood event. Natasha is just referring to that issue of testing for illicit drugs. Natasha saying in known areas buyers can request it. I know it happened in Moreton Bay. Yeah, I think that the distinction there, Natasha, is that what the earlier correspondent was suggesting in New Zealand, it's compulsory when you're selling to have that test, whereas in Australia it's not. You can have it done. Natasha, you're also asking my thoughts on Launceston. Well, I was on Saturday. I was on the All Money program on sort of the Fox Business Channel on TV, and they asked me to come along with 10 locations I thought people should be considering as growth markets at the moment, in contrast to all the negative stuff in media about everywhere being in decline, which I know isn't true. And one of the places I talked about was Launceston as a market that's been growing, still growing. Hobart's been the strongest capital city for the last couple of years in terms of property selling the fastest, price growth. Also got the lowest vacancies in capital city Australia. Now, it's not just confined to Hobart. Regional Tasmania's been really strong as well. Right around regional Tasmania, there are markets with prices growing, but Launceston is the most notable of them. It's the biggest. It's the number 2 city, getting really strong growth, but still very affordable. A lot of suburbs have median prices in the 200,000, some in the low to mid 300,000s, but it's great value for money. A lot of buyers out of Melbourne looking at it saying, wow, property sure is cheap there, and look, it's growing and the rental yields are great, and Launceston is a strong growing city. So yeah, it's one that's still worth considering, even though it's had a bit of growth. It's not finished yet, and it's one that I think is going to be long-term good, because the Tasmanian economy used to rank last. It used to be always ranked last, but that's changed a lot. And the ComSec State of the State report for the last, say, 2 years, Tasmania has been solid in 4th place. It's ranked above Queensland and Western Australia and South Australia as an economy consistently. It's really become a lot stronger. So it's become a growth state, whereas previously it was a state that showed very little growth. And that's been reflected in what's happening in property markets around Tasmania, and with Launceston right at the forefront of it. Rodney's asking my thoughts on the Brisbane Bayside, Manly, Wynnum, later, etc. Look, yeah, Rodney, I think it's really underrated. For some reason, Brisbane's never really given a top rating to its the Moreton Bayside areas. Really make a lot of sense. In many other cities, the suburbs that front the bays are very highly rated, whereas in Brisbane, the top ranked suburbs tend to be more focused on the Brisbane River, closer to where the CBD is. So I think you know, there are really some really good suburbs out there. There's always steady buyers' interest there. Right now, they're ticking over quite well, getting good demand. Prices, yeah. I'll just have a look at a couple of examples while we're talking about it. I'll give you an example. Manly, Queensland. Yeah, I mean, the median house price for the suburb of Manly over on the Bayside of Brisbane is 785,000, and it's risen a couple of percent in the last 12 months. So it's sort of certainly, it's not falling, but it's not sort of booming either. Then we've got Wynnum, median price 650,000. It's also risen. Okay. So a lot of potential there, but I think it's kind of underrated and probably deserves better attention. I'll just look at Lota. Lota's got a median price of 615,000. Those areas not showing a lot of price growth at the moment. Other parts of Brisbane, like the Moreton Bay local government area up in the northern suburbs of Brisbane, are doing a lot better in terms of price growth at the moment, mainly because of affordability. A lot of cheap suburbs up there attracting buyers on the budget. Elaine's asking, what are your thoughts on Camden in New South Wales? Not sure whether to sell at the moment. Look, Camden, down in the far southwest of the Sydney metropolitan area, the sort of areas that are holding up much better in the downturn than other parts of Sydney. You know, the more expensive areas of Sydney have seen quite a bit of price decline. The areas, the outer ring areas like Camden, Campbelltown, Blacktown, Penrith, they're holding up their pricing a lot better. Still getting demand from first home buyers. But in terms of whether you should sell or not, I mean, it's not the sort of market you really want to sell into if you don't have to. I'm not sure what your motivation for thinking of selling is, whether it's because you're worried that the values are going to fall. You know, Sydney's been through 5 years of growth, and you know, Camden has, I'll just key it in here and have a look at what the suburb of Camden. I know Camden's a local government area as well as a suburb. Yeah, prices have fallen a bit in the last 12 months, but over the last 10 years, the growth has averaged about 8% a year, and that's reflecting the 4 or 5 years of growth we've had until recently. if you don't need to sell, you certainly wouldn't want to sell into a market that's in decline, as Sydney, generally speaking, is at the moment. But the correction that's happening is something that always happens after a sustained boom. There's nothing particularly remarkable about the current decline in the Sydney market. It's we've seen it happen before after a lengthy boom period. Prices have risen this much, and they're probably going to drop that much. So, in net terms, people have owned for 5 or 10 years are going to still come out ahead by a wide margin. So, it's not necessarily a major concern. I think it's been grossly overrated and sensationalised by a fairly rabid media that's obsessing over the negative headlines they can generate out of it at the moment. So Rodney, just referring to those Bayside areas, gentrification happening at the moment. Yeah, I believe that's happening. Yeah, I really sort of think that Brisbane should appreciate those suburbs overlooking the bay a lot more, getting those sea breezes and all of that. And I think over time, their popularity will rise. Okay, so we've been going for an hour and 10 minutes, getting towards that point where I start to consider calling an end to it. When my throat starts to get sure, I know I've been talking for too long. So last chance out there. Anybody got any questions? Now's the opportunity, because I'm going to be here for a whole lot longer. Belinda is asking, what do you think of Brisbane units at the moment? You mentioned Kangaroo Point. It'll be a while before it goes up again. Yeah, that market's been oversupplied for a while, as I'm sure you're aware, Belinda. The vacancy rates are still too high, but they're not as high as they were. Areas that previously had like 6% vacancies, now we're getting down to 3.5%, 4%. So it's trending in the right direction. The Brisbane CBD is still pretty high, 7% last time I checked, I think, the vacancy rate. So later this year, we might be at the point where that sort of Brisbane inner city apartment market starts to sort of settle down, and vacancies get down to a level where it's not having a negative impact on property markets and on pricing. But I'll just have a look at Kangaroo Point. Yeah, it's kind of typical when you look at suburbs like Fortitude Valley, Kangaroo Point, Wollongabba, South Brisbane. What's happening with pricing? It's a negative result in the last 12 months. According to these figures, the median price for Kangaroo Point apartments is $475,000. It's dropped 6 or 7% in the last 12 months. So that's kind of typical what we're seeing at the moment. Days on the market, 85. So it's taken quite a long time to sell properties. Still, negative perceptions about that market persist because we still have high vacancies, and the Brisbane market overall isn't, generally speaking, pumping either. But I think momentum is building in Brisbane with population data favouring it, and the economy improving and infrastructure spending starting to rise. We're going to see better outcomes for Brisbane going forward, but it hasn't boomed the way Sydney has, because it just hasn't had the drivers that Sydney and Melbourne have had recently. And there was overbuilding in those inner city apartment markets, but they are gradually improving. So the prospects for returning to some sort of growth might be not too far off. Another 6 or 12 months, perhaps. Rodney's saying, do you think Canberra has any more run left? I think Canberra has got a lot of potential. I recently spoke at a seminar event in Canberra and did quite a bit of research before doing that, and reaffirmed my view that Canberra's got arguably the strongest real estate economy in Australia, by which I mean all the underlying factors that are important to real estate, like the state of the local economy, average incomes, the rate of unemployment, all those sort of underlying factors that have an impact on real estate. They're very, very strong in Canberra. Highest average incomes, lowest unemployment, one of the strongest economies, the third ranked economy in the nation according to the CommSec State of the States report. Very low vacancy rates, steady demand. It's just a really solid place, Canberra. I mean, it's got an unfair advantage, of course, being the capital city, the government city, and by that means that it's always solid. It doesn't very often boom, but it never busts either. It's just solid. And for people who value that, safety, solidity, always going to be steady, it's a good place to consider. And like I say, the strongest real estate economy in the country right now, amongst the capital cities at least anyway. Yes, Rodney, you point out you have to budget for the land tax, yeah. That is a bit of an issue, but one of the things about property values in Canberra is that the supply of new land, etc., is so controlled and sort of drip fed to the market of the territory government, and demand always exceeds supply. So property values are underpinned by that, I think. Okay. Well, I think that's probably a good point to end tonight's broadcast. We've been going for an hour and 15 minutes, and my throat is starting to hurt, which means I've been talking for too long. So I think I'll sign off. Thanks everyone for participating tonight. We've had a lot of good questions. Interesting locations have been raised as a discussion point. We've talked about the negative gearing issue. We've talked about some out of left field type issues like testing for drugs and properties that are for sale. And it's been, once again, very interesting. So thank you for your participation and your contribution. I hope you've found it interesting. And if you have any follow-up thoughts or questions, you're welcome to contact me by email, ryder@hotspotting.com.au. If you're interested in any of the locations that we've talked about tonight, you can go to the Hotspotting website, and we do have location reports about many of the locations we've talked about tonight, as well as our top 5 hotspots type reports. Also other services such as strategy sessions where you can have one-on-one discussion with me about your particular situation and what you might be thinking of doing. It's always good to have a sounding board to get a dispassionate third party with a bit of knowledge, giving you some thoughts on what you're thinking of doing or which way you should head. Okay, that's it for now. Thanks for participating. Let's do it.